Okay, Sulochana, now this live, so you start.
Okay, okay, thank you. Am I audible now?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you are audible.
Hello, hello, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Decoding Realpolitik. After a short break, we are back with another exciting session today. And the topic for today's session will be geopolitical narratives and contest over South Asian spaces. To guide us through this, we are glad to have Mr. Shubhranil Ghosh, who will be sharing his insights on this topic. We warmly welcome you, sir. And Mr. Ghosh is currently an assistant professor of political science at Rampurhat College under the University of Burdwan. He has done his MPhil from Jadavpur University, and his research focuses on political violence and narrative value of geopolitical narratives. Now, I would like to request Mr. Ghosh to begin with his talk. And this is for the viewers. If you have any queries or questions, Mr. Ghosh will be addressing at the end of this session. Thank you. So you may start now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Sulochana, and thank you for that introduction. My sincerest thanks to the organizers. Without further ado, I will start sharing my PowerPoint presentation. I have around 9 slides. I'll go through them slowly and I'll take some time to explain every point. After the slides are over, you can fire away your questions as you want. Okay. For the time being, I'll just turn off my camera because it'll be easier for me. Okay. I'll keep my mic on. So I hope the slides are visible. Hello.
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Okay. Okay.
Yes,
I'll continue. Yes. So very exciting topic actually, and very relevant given the times that we are currently in. Uh, we do find the word geopolitics being thrown around a lot, and I'm afraid sometimes when words like geopolitics or particularly heavy words like geopolitics are thrown around, they tend to lose their innate meaning, because when you start using geopolitics for explaining every uh, kind of political phenomenon that encompasses or involves states, you tend to actually render the term geopolitics as input. But given that, letting that aside, since we today are talking about geopolitical narratives and the contest over South Asian spaces, I'll first start with the basic idea as to what is it that we mean when we use the word geopolitics. When we use the word geopolitics, I think by now this is fairly common knowledge, but I'll just go through it uh, in a in a short span of time. That the word geopolitics, or the geo, would obviously mean that it is related to the global landmass that we have, and the global map upon which states often find themselves on opposing sides, which means that on a global map, two different states can often find themselves at loggerheads with each other. And that's part of the process of geopolitics. But but given that aside, if you leave aside the geo part of it, we also have to look at the politics part of it. Now, when we study geopolitics, we often have to make a critical distinction between geopolitics and political geography. Geopolitics and political geography are related, but mind you, those are two very distinct fields. Those fields they're not coterminous. And the distinction between these two fields should not be collapsed. What do I mean by that? So when we use the word political geography, I think the writings of Saul Bernard Cohen is a very celebrated geopolitical researcher and an analyst. His writings are very lucid and they actually point to a clear distinction that when we talk about political geography is basically looking at the spatial distribution of states on the global map. The spatial distribution. So if I were to open the map, or if you can see this, that if you can see the globe here, on the globe, you will see continents, and in the continents, you would see that there are states. The arrangement of those states, so the arrangement of those states is such that we draw up political boundaries and we tend to differentiate one state from the other. But this is about it when it comes to political geography. Political geography is largely going to deal with this aspect, the spatial distribution of states on the global landscape. But that's not exactly what geopolitics deals with. If you look at the first bulletin point here, geopolitics is essentially the study of how geographical factors, incorporating both physical and human elements, come to shape and influence the behavior of states and inform state actions. Now, on the surface, this definition might appear very simplistic, but it's actually not. Because once you again take a look at geography is ultimately, or the global map, you would look that geography actually places certain limitations on states or how states operate actually. We've all heard the old adage that states do not choose their geography. States cannot choose their neighborhood. So when a certain state finds itself in a certain kind of region, geographical region, or in a certain kind of geographical neighborhood, where it is surrounded by states which are not so friendly, then you can imagine the kind of pressures and the kind of tensions that the state that particular state has to operate on. Think in a way, I'm not going to make too fine a point to it, but if you look at the region of West Asia, now I don't want to make any hasty conclusions that West Asia is perennially, it has a proclivity to war and conflict. It cannot exist in peace. No, those are value judgments. I'd rather ask you to look at the historical trajectory of the region. West Asia has experienced perennial instability. And so any state in that region is technically existing in a pretty rough neighborhood. And when it is existing in a pretty rough neighborhood, if we look at what states, if we go back to our preliminary lessons on what states want, what states actually strive for, the number one, the numero uno goal that a state will strive for is always security. So a state has to effectively exist on the map. Otherwise, if a state ceases to exist on the map, there is no possibility that. Otherwise, if the state does not exist on the map, it will be extremely difficult for any other goal of the state or any other objective of the state to fructify. It won't. So unless and until you survive, you can't go up, or you can't pursue the next goal of prosperity. You can't pursue the next or the other goals of prestige. You won't be able to influence larger events outside your immediate, which means when you're caught in a certain geography or in a certain geographical environment, your strategic choices become automatically very limited. This effectively means that you will have to respond to certain contingencies that your geographical environment imposes upon you. You could see one of the this is something that you would be able to find out if you were to look at how, or if you were to study how the Soviet Union, the erstwhile Soviet Union, or the USSR actually behaved or actually looked at Europe. No matter what the Soviet Union's ideological proclamations were, I ask you to look at their geopolitical activities. I would ask you to look at their strategic vision and what they were actively planning before, in the event of the Second World War. So, what were they planning? If we look at many writings by Stalin or many writings of that time, strategists of that time, the Soviet Union was always afraid of an invasion from Europe. That is why the Soviet Union was faced with very difficult strategic choices. They wanted buffering states around their borders, which would give them an early warning system in the wake of an attack from Western Europe. If you look, so that is one of the reasons, one of their, I would stress, their justification, Soviet justification for invading Finland, Soviet justifications for invading Poland, just as the Second World War commenced. They wanted territory in order to make preparations for warding off future conflict. This actual trade-off between going in for a short-term conflict in order to supposedly prevent a long-term conflict, something that is at the cornerstone of geopolitical thinking. Even today, if you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I would request you all, for a time being, forget what narratives that around the world are trying to imbue this invasion with. I would request you to look at what Russia was continuously pointing at when NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was moving eastwards. In the wake of 1990, when the USSR disintegrated, the erstwhile Soviet Union or the USSR disintegrated, the stated promise by major Western leaders, specifically the United States, the French, and the Germans, was that NATO would not move eastwards. That was the stated promise. But from that point onwards, today, we have seen that NATO has continuously moved eastwards. Moved westwards. Where has NATO been most? Where has NATO been mostly active in? NATO has been mostly active in trying to incorporate these Eastern European or the Central East and Southern European states, which were at one point of time part of the Warsaw Pact or allied to the Warsaw Pact. The Russians, when at a point of time when their power differentials with the West was vast, especially in the after the 1990s, the Russians had to accept this. But mind you, they did not accept this very happy. They were accepting this grudgingly. But slowly, the Russians would also put their foot down. So if you look at Georgia, or if you look at the Russian adventures in Chechnya, or if you look at the contemporary conflict that's going on, the Russians have a very clear rationale that these states constitute the inalienable sphere of influence that Russia possesses, or Russia has a right to. Therefore, whenever geographical contingencies arise, states have to respond strategically. But mind you, the state responses are almost always limited. There aren't many good options on the table, which is why you see the advent of such small scale and mid scale conflicts. And they are so common, it is almost impossible to prevent them from happening. Now, notice that I was continuously talking about two things: states and geographic space. Now, this is perhaps in my mind the most interesting part of geopolitics, that in geopolitics, the relationship between the state and the space is almost sentient, as in if you look at the work of Friedrich Ratzel was, if we go back to history, Friedrich Ratzel was a very famous German geographer from the early 17th century. And he was the first person comprehensively come up with the idea of geopolitics. He termed it as human geography, but over time, Friedrich Ratzel's ideas have largely flown into or have influenced considerable points of knowledge across disciplines. And he came up with two very important terms, one of which is that the organic state. The organic state. Now, the state as a living organism is something that geopolitics ascribes to. Geopolitics gives a sense of sentience or a sense of consciousness to a state. And according to Ratzel, just as human beings need nourishment to survive, just as human cells and the human biology needs nourishment to survive, the state, being an organic entity with sentience, will require nourishment to survive and will certainly, to that end, seek out the means that will make its survival or that will ensure its survival. So, when we come to that, we often would have to ask ourselves, what is it that states require in the form of nourishment? What is it that states require as a means to facilitate their survival? And that is space. Lo and behold, according to Ratzel, states as conscious entities have to expand over space as a confirmation of its vitality. For Ratzel, mind you, if a state does not expand and does not incorporate spaces, then a state is in decline, or a state is in ill health. So a state that expands and controls space is fundamentally a healthy, vital state, and a state that is contracting is fundamentally an emaciated state. Therefore, states will always seek out space, but space here, you have to recognize that empty space isn't necessarily what a state is looking for. Conventional geopolitical scholars across the board stress on this fact that states are always seeking for space which is rich in natural resources. It is, or it used to at a point of time, sought territory for settling large demographies or large sections of its population, and it's also looking for fertile riverine or fertile portions of territory which can facilitate food production. All three of this, if you look at all three of these factors, natural resources, you would be wondering how, you would have heard this, that states require natural resources. But what I'm trying to tell you is that look at how states actually have this drive for pursuing natural resources. Today, let me ask you, what would be the most important natural resource that major states, the United States, the Chinese, the Europeans, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Russians are all striving for? Can anyone tell me? I'm just opening this conversation. Can anybody tell me what is the most important or significant natural resource that states today are striving to capture? If there's anyone interested, they can suggest it. I'd be happy to listen to it. Can anyone tell me what kind of natural resources are actively on the radar of states? Well, currently, and you would have seen this, rare earth metals are something that most major states across the world are seeking to capture or seeking to acquire. Rare earth metals. This is why you see why Africa, parts of Australia, parts of Latin America, they are becoming points of competition between major geopolitical actors. Why are rare earth metals today so vital? Rare earth metals are vital because every aspect of modern technology that we rely on our central processors, our semiconductors, everything, our smartphone batteries, everything, all of that. It's all being it's all developed by rare earth. It's basically a product of rare earth metals. Otherwise, you wouldn't sorry, a finished product of rare earth metals. Without these rare earth metals, you would be experiencing a kind of crisis where our grids, our technology, everything would just collapse. So metals like scandium, yttrium, these are so important. Cerium, these are actually very, very important for making making semiconductors and allied technologies. Additionally, they're also very important for transition to renewable energy. When we want to look at clean energy and we want to create solar batteries, we want to create EV, or when EV as in, I'm sure that all of you have heard of the attempts by the government of India, to make or manufacture electric vehicles. These are quite delicate. These technologies are delicate and they're just on the market. So dealing with so dealing with them or handling them requires steady supply chains of rare earth metals. This is the reason states at any point of time will always look to capture these resources. When we were talking about spaces rich in resources during the world wars, we were looking for oil, for iron ore, for coal. Cut to the late 20th century, the struggle for oil was particularly very vicious. Today, it has been substituted by this drive for rare earth. Two, the state requires space for settling population. Think of colonization. Think of the settler colonialist desire. That is one of the reasons why states used to be in the search for space. And finally, food production. One of the reasons why conflicts used to happen in Germany during the early modern period, especially, was that German soil. I'll share the sources of it if anyone is interested towards. German soil was not very fertile. That is why you would have the Germans continuously hungering for land because it was so crucial. German land has historically has had poor agricultural. This is why they've been always trying to expand towards the east, towards the Polish, the Ukrainian region. If you look at it, it's actually a very fertile region. So if you go step by step, states will always search for spaces which are conducive to its expansion, but this expansion must have the final objective of either capturing natural resources or settling part of its population or capturing fertile soil for food production or having all three of them. This is this is why the state and space relation is so important in the arena of geopolitics. It's the most important constitutive premise upon which we have to base our explorations and research and investigations. Now, so as I said, states would obviously search for spaces that can enable the acquisition of resources. And to that end, this is where we introduce the word strategy. Strategies become important. Strategies are then becoming a very natural and organic exercise by the states to acquire space. So, what is a strategy? On a very basic level, it's a plan of action. Plan of action that a state would come up with in order to achieve a long-term aim. State strategies, therefore, are always oriented towards focusing on economic development, focusing a level of national security, sustainability, etc. But in this context, the strategy that states will employ has to be in direct relation to how it wants to acquire space. Space that is rich in, as I said, the three kinds of resources or the three kinds of amenities: natural resources, the ability to shift parts of its population, and fertile soil for food production. So you would think that a fairly cogent argument is emerging concerning geopolitics, and that geopolitics is essentially the mechanical pursuit of states in search of space. But that's again not very true, because while states do want to expand and acquire space, states also are cognizant of the narrative value of space. And space capture through narrative capture is also a critical part of geopolitics. The question would arise, so what is a narrative? Narratives are essentially devices that convey meaning and facilitate the sharing of experience in trying to make sense of the world. So, whenever we are deploying narratives, we are trying to make a broad range where by and large we have an idea of how our immediate environment functions and what we need to do in order to navigate the complexities within that said environment. It gives us a sense of predictability. It gives us a sense of safety. It gives us a sense of preparation. However, narratives are not really that innocent when it comes to states. They might seem innocuous on the surface, but state behavior requires narratives specifically because narratives are expedient in justifying state actions and also imbuing value and meaning to the actions of states or the policies of states, to the effect that even genocide, now that kind of horror that we want to avoid, genocide. During most of the 20th century, genocide has been justified through narratives. So narratives are something that states are very comfortable in using and deploying. And narratives are also something that states would find easy to hide, which actually brings us to the next. And if you recall that I had told you that Friedrich Ratzel came up with two important ideas. One was the organic state, the other is Lebensraum, or living space. When we talk about Lebensraum or living space, we are effective working on the premise that the state in question, Germany, is short of living space, is geographically and spatially pressed, and it is confronted with difficult choices. Therefore, it has to pursue a policy of expansion eastward. You see how this narrative actually just a single word like Lebensraum or living space activates multiple meanings at multiple levels. You think that this word is pretty innocuous. You've heard of this. Many of the esteemed guests and august audience members have heard of this. Whenever we talk about Nazi Germany, we talk about the word Lebensraum or living space. But Lebensraum or living space is actually a very critical geopolitical narrative. And the narrative keeps on justifying the behavior or the policies and actions of German states towards Eastern Europe and then onto Russia throughout the two world wars. During the First World, if you recall, Germany had effectively been declared the victor on the Eastern Front of the First World. Because what happened? Go back to history. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed between the newly emerged Soviet Russia and the Central Powers, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, the Austria-Hungarian Empire. The Russians withdrew from World War I, and the Russian Empire effectively lost control over large swaths of its territory. Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, the Caucasian provinces, all of it to Germany. So the narrative of Lebensraum had seen partial fruition during the First World War and in the closing months of the First World War. It was only because the Central Powers were comprehensively defeated on the Western Front that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was invalidated. However, in the German side, the Germans believed that they had won the war on the East and the territory was rightfully theirs. So you see that kind of thinking actually influenced the Germans to again, at this time, launching the largest land invasion in history, which was Operation Barbarossa, the German conquest of the Soviet Union, the attack on the Soviet. A simple word, Lebensraum. Yet, the word that unleashed a narrative that unleashed that kind of destructive. This is why geopolitical narratives are prime examples of how they can be used to simultaneously justify and fructify expansive operations. Justify, how are they justifying? So when a state is attempting to expand, the state justifies it as the necessity or the point of requirement for its survival and for its health and well-being. Fructify is how the state uses the narrative to actually devise short-term tactics and strategies in order to bring about the expansion or the capture. So when states deploy material resources and assets, you have to remember they also deploy narratives. And the interesting part about narratives is narratives are often always flowing around you. Think of it's actually a geopolitical narrative, but think of it's worded in such a way that it sounds very fuzzy and nice. Think of the American proclamations of promoting democracy and human rights. Think of how Russia, as I said earlier, towards the beginning, how Russia constructs the idea of the near abroad. What is the near abroad? Near abroad is basically strategic buffers. Strategic buffers, which it would use, as I said, as an early warning system. Think of narratives like the Chinese Middle Kingdom, that the Chinese state is at the center of the earth. See, these narratives, these are narratives that are circulated, and while most of us, we are fairly alert and aware and engaged, these narratives, when they hit supposedly people outside this discipline or outside this field, they would not really think about it much. They would take the narrative on face value. But as I said, these narratives are integrated as part of state strategies. So they're never innocent. They're never innocuous. Just as Lebensraum had the potential to unleash that much destructive power on Europe and Russia, many of these narratives that great powers come up with have a latent destructive potential. And that's why we need to be careful. So when they are constructing geopolitical narratives, states are essentially attempting to render a region amenable to their interests. So a state looks at a geographical region, a major power, and finds that necessary it's necessary to for it's necessary for the satiation of its own strategic interests. Whenever that happens, they have to make the space amenable. And when two major powers start eyeing the same space, an element of dynamism is imbued into that space. And then we have geopolitical rivalry. Think of the Cold War. Think of how the Cold War, the first or the opening years of the Cold War, saw Europe being carved out. The space actually became so dynamic that it emerged into a theater for geopolitical rivalry. And the narratives that were used, the narratives are very interesting. The Americans or the West used the narratives of freedom, democracy. The Soviets would use the narratives of people's rights. And these ideas then become so important in understanding how the geopolitical scheme of things are. So moving on to the next, geopolitical narratives are also intrinsically connected to state power and power projection and how states perceive the global geography, as I just said earlier. So here, major powers generally have the resources and the wherewithal at their disposal to project power effectively and perceive the global geography in a way that suits their interests. Think of the United States, think of the Chinese, the Russians. So the most powerful states at any given point of time would regularly employ these elaborate geopolitical narratives to control and influence spaces with their constituent population. Think about the proxy war during the Cold War that was happening in parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America. And these narratives would then necessitate the great powers to preserve existent but poorly demarcated spheres of influence that serve the purpose of security and prosperity. Now, here we introduce another term, that is sphere of influence. Again, we've all heard of this term, spheres of influence. But why are spheres of influence necessary? Spheres of influence become necessary because a great power or a powerful state wants to assert political or military control over weaker states to the exclusion of other great powers. Think about America's Monroe Doctrine. What was the Monroe Doctrine premising on? Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was generally premised on creating a sphere of influence in South America where European powers or external powers would not have any influence. The Americans effectively excluded that region from the influence of other states. But even other than that, if we look at choke points, the control over choke points. Now, what are choke points? So, if possible, I'll show you the map. Choke points are those regions on the globe which are narrow or restricted, and yet they control access between larger areas, the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca. Now, these choke points are also vital for facilitating global trade routes and supply chains. Supply chains are another word. Supply chains are words that, again, we are very familiar with, particularly in the wake of COVID. Securing supply chains, which means there is a tacit understanding that supply chains are vulnerable. Major states would often, the anxieties that generally the Americans have concerning China, that China might control certain choke points or dominate certain supply chains. Basically this. Now, if we come to South Asia, this is where the interesting part is. South Asia as a space is actually looking at multiple conflicting narratives which are adjacent to each other. It has been historically, it has been a site for great power or superpower rivalry, whichever you want to call it. When the British East Indian Company was competing with the French, with the Dutch, with the Portuguese, when the British and the Russians were competing over for the great game, control over parts of the subcontinent, when the Japanese were competing with the Western Allies, and then also during the Cold War, when the region was a site for competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. That part of the narrative surrounding South Asia is fairly historically validated. But it begs the question, does this crystallization into is this crystallization of the region into an extended theater for rivalry and competition? Is it all there is to it? Is it all there is to this region? Does the region not have any dynamism to its own? Don't the constituent states in the region have some legitimate claims? Now, before we embark on legitimacy, we have to recognize that the fractured nature of the South Asian space is such that if you look at the states, in a way, historically, these states did not exist with any precedent of centralized authority. After the British adventures in the subcontinent and after the British left, most of these states have been carved out of the Indian subcontinent. They were part of the same geographic, the immediacy and the proximity was very imminent. However, while being proximate, they almost never experienced a kind of overarching political authority or even any form of shared political control. Therefore, this space is not clearly defined in terms of spatial interest by any stakeholder in the region. Most of the states in this region are not, I should use the word clear, about how they should go about the space. They're aware of the immediacy of their neighbors. If you visualize the South Asian map, most of the South Asian states are around the territory of India. In such a map, there are multiple points of anxiety. And there is of course the tried and tested binary relationship between India and Pakistan. However, even while there have been intermittent conflicts, none of these states, as I said, till now, the Radzelian conventional narrative, or even if you consider Mackinder or Mahan, you won't be able to apply it to South Asia. The region and the space of South Asia is such, it is in a state of intermediated flux that you won't be able to pigeonhole it or label anything. Plus, additionally, the fragmentation of South Asia is not only an interstate problem, it's also an intrastate problem. Think Balochistan. Think the problem that we have, the issue that we have with Kashmir. Think the problem that we used to have, or we still have at a certain level, with Arunachal Pradesh, or with Mizoram, or with Manipur. Think about the Tamil community and their struggle for Tamil Elam in Sri Lanka. There is no, you see, while there is no outward demarcation of spaces that states want, there is also continuous inward tension, internal crisis. This ultimately makes it difficult for the states to negotiate with its geographical realities and navigate out of the complexities of the city. If I think many of you have heard of Sankar and Krishna and the phenomenon of cartographic anxiety, it is something that perfectly sums up the problem of South Asian states. While Sankar and Krishna applied this to Indian leaders, because the Indian leaders were particularly anxious about parts of Kashmir they felt which was rightfully part of India being held by Pakistan, parts of the eastern border or parts of India's rightful claims to territory being held by China. And so Indian leaders were particularly very anxious about. See, the problem is the leaders of the other states in every other arena in South Asia also experience a very particular kind of cartographic anxiety. It's one of the reasons why territories it's one of the reasons why territory is such a sore point and it's such a undefined point of concern and conflict and tension. Having said that, so what would be solutions? Solutions have to prioritize renegotiation of narratives. Narratives of geopolitical expansion cannot and do not work in salvation. States here, in order to search for vitality, in order to search for quote unquote the means to survival, have to come to terms with each other. I'm not suggesting cooperation because many more authoritative accounts of cooperation have been suggested by us. I'm suggesting a point, a framework where risks and liabilities are distributed in such a way that while cooperation cannot be ensured, conflict or these intermittent crises that involve multiple states in South Asia, that can be averted and avoided. So with that, I would finally end this topic and end my presentation. I would be happy to take questions. Thank you so much. Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir.
একটু পরে
Hello.
কথা বলছি একটু পরে কথা বলছি।
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for your insightful and engaging presentation, sir. I hope they are very informative and thought-provoking questions are here, and so hope. I think there are some questions, sir. So one of the questions, sir, that is come from Devanjan Banerjee. Sir, you can see in your screen.
Yeah. Why the states instead of trading in person? State strategic culture. Yes, absolutely. I think if we were to limit our understanding to conventional geopolitics, if we look at the Redzelian sense, or if we look at Hoshofer, states would find it more aligned to their strategic culture or in tune with their strategic culture to pursue warfare, then look at the more rational option, that is trade and purchasing resources. It's one of the reasons when we look at the post Second World War world order. I'm not sure it comes in the term world order comes in quotes, but the world order that was based on trade and exchange are looked at as very effective tools in averting warfare. However, even when we look at trade and even when we look at purchasing routes, we again come to the problem of choke points and supply chains. And today, in the current scenario, we are familiar with the term weaponizing trade. Trade is being weaponized by major states. The Americans are accusing the Chinese of doing it. The Chinese are accusing the Americans of doing it. But the simple fact is, it's happening. So even this can be, in a way, manipulated to serve certain hard strategic interests. That would be my response.
Okay. There's another question where Sir Mantu Bhagat.
I'm not well. I appreciate the sentiment behind the question that open media, but I'm not sure how open actually this media is. What do you actually categorize as open media? Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. What do you mean by open? If you are saying that everyone can put up their views on Twitter, yes, I agree with you. That we can put up our views on Twitter, we can put up our views on Facebook and YouTube. But then right now, you and I are having this conversation. Here we are also exchanging views. If we are talking about views or if we are talking about the circulation of content as it's happening on social media platform, then that's okay. But if you are asking about openness, if you remember, uh, during the Russian war, during the first months of the Russian war in Ukraine, Elon Musk was actually directing some of his private satellites to help the Ukrainians in targeting Russian forces. Now, we all know Elon Musk is very much connected to X. So, when we look at the openness of media, I'm not very sure if this premise stands. Many of such platforms are banned in many states, so it doesn't really serve a purpose. But to the extent that narratives like portraying Western powers in a very benevolent light, yes, to that extent, yes, the narratives are reinforced. But other than that, these platforms don't. I don't think they actively can be used to spearhead state policy or state strategies. They can be used to supplement the policies or strategies of the states at a certain level, but they can't take an initiative. I think that would be my response.
Sorry, sir. May I add or
Yes,
something on that?
yes, yes, yes.
Since yes, I actually agree with you that these are not open media because many countries these are under surveillance or put many restrictions by government. But when it comes to Western narratives, for example, because one of the incident that I faced in when Ukraine and Russia conflict broke out, right? So at that time, I wrote an article on South Asia Monitor, I believe. So and I also shared it in Facebook, right? And my argument was not aligned with the US narrative, right? And after some days, I found that my my shared article was downed by Facebook. So from that perspective, I think these are actually working for their deep state. I mean, for US. So this is how they're reinforcing their interest or their narratives. For example, in this case, US. But yeah, when it comes to India or other third world or developing countries, I don't think this platform or this new media actually we can call it instead of open media. Uh, this doesn't help for this third world country or us.
Yeah, I think you see you harped on the point. You see, these things can be weaponized. Media
Yes.
can be weaponized and redirected towards the newly emerging countries of the global south or the third world or the developing world. So media will always portray certain narratives. If you look at media, they would portray India in a certain light. The same media would always portray the parent country, United States, in a certain light. This is how, as you were saying, these narratives are weaponized in such a way that they can be utilized against anyone they see fit. One of the things is when the Americans claim the promotion of freedom, democracy, and human rights. That's one of the most. It's a very interesting
Plot.
statement. Yeah, it's a very interesting statement. So, but you see how it's the premise is that the external regions outside the United States require American military and political presence in order to be democratically governed. The narrative is that without American intervention, democracies cannot survive in the extended world. So this is a narrative that clearly reinforces American hegemony and dominance. Without the Americans, the democratic world would fall apart. That's the narrative. Yeah. So that's that.
True, sir.
Okay, sir. There is another question by Kalyan Roy. That is, where does geopolitical narrative and reality get blurred?
Yes, a very interesting question. I think this is a very, very interesting question. It's one of the reasons why uh, narratives cannot be neatly separated from the real world, or the or actually making sense of the real world. You know, Kollan, if I were to ask you a counter question, how would you go about it? If I were to ask you that the Soviet Union made the largest sacrifices to emerge as the victor or save the world from the fascist threat during World War II. This is a narrative, and it's not really very far from reality. Because if we look at the number of casualties, the Soviet Union suffered the largest number of casualties during the Second World War. Plus, they lost enormous amounts of resource, I think, in basically human lives. But is the narrative really holding water? Would you think that that narrative actually holds water? Do you think that the Soviet Union could have actually defeated the Germans without British and American help in the form of Lend-Lease? Or better still, do you think India would have been able to triumph over Pakistan in 1971, or even during 1965? 65 was fairly settled in our favor, but without Soviet help, Soviet political help, the narrative would be that India emerged victorious. And the reality is, yes, we obviously we the Pakistanis signed the instrument of surrender to General Jagjit Singh Arora in 1971. But we didn't do it alone. So if you look very keenly, you would be able to make certain distinctions. Yes, they overlap. I agree with you completely, Kullan. Yes, they overlap, and it becomes very difficult to neatly separate the two. But you can act, if you go deep enough, you can sometimes make a distinction. You can be objective. I'm not saying you can be neutral. Neutrality is A, not desirable, B, not possible. But you can be objective at times. That's something that I would feel.
Okay, sir.
Yes. So now you've come to the absolute meat of the argument. So let's look at it this way. Were the Americans promoting freedom and democracy in Vietnam? It's a very, very clear premise. Were the Americans testing freedom and democracy or promoting freedom and democracy in Vietnam? Observable facts. You have the images of American atrocities, the bombing of Vietnamese children, the use of Agent Orange and napalm on Vietnamese villages, firebombing large tracts of Vietnamese forests. How do you fashion freedom and democracy out of this kind of violence? When a state is engaging in this kind of terrible violence, that is the point where you have an inflection between the narrative and the observable reality. Because a state would obviously want to secure its strategic objectives. But while doing so, when you recognize that it's pursuing policies that are facilitating large scale violence, conflict, and then you clearly understand what that state is up to. Geopolitical narratives are very useful for selling around the globe. They're useful in a terms of they're useful soft deployment, as I said during the PPT, softly deploying your ideas in order to gain legitimacy. But when you recognize the kind of violence and atrocities they commit, you have to ask yourself, where does that legitimacy go? Are they still in a legitimate sphere of operation? I think that is something that we can focus on. That would be my response.
Thank you, sir. It seems there are a few more questions. I think one or two.
Yes, sure. It's the relationship between
And
geopolitics, realist philosophy, and a very good question, actually. Yes, I think if you look at a basic dictum of realist philosophy, that there is no sovereign authority, or there is no higher authority over states. States are the supreme sovereign authority. There is no global sovereign that actively mediates conflict between states. There's no one. The United Nations does not do anything like that. There are only states, and states have the prerogative to act in their interest. So if that is an axiom, it's axiomatic. States will ultimately, according to conventional geopolitics, states will always look for space that helps it to secure one of three of its objectives: resources that power economic prosperity, or space that enables it access to certain regions from which it was hitherto excluded out of, or, as I said, as as was the example during the Second World War, searching for space that would facilitate food production. Realist philosophy would give us that states are the only sovereign authorities. There is no supreme sovereign authority over states. Geopolitics would tell us that then states have to survive and they have to search for spaces. Strategic culture would then come up with the tools and technologies that a state would deploy in order to secure such spaces. And securing that can be material. It also can be very subjective. It can be a kind of culture, socio-spatio-cultural. So that is how, at least as I see it, that is how these three aspects keep influencing one another.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
I I think Raja might lost his network. So
Okay, okay,
this is the last question from the same person,
okay.
Devanjan Banerjee.
Yes. So how much Indian domestic political perceptions determine how policymakers look towards South Asian space for policy making? Well, you see, the thing about India is that our domestic politics, right from the 1950s, have actually been very deeply connected with the immediacy of our strategic space. So, be it Pakistan, be it China, domestic anxieties of our decision makers, political decisions, have pushed us to pursue a certain line when it comes to China and Pakistan. But while that is true, yes, that is fundamentally true. The problem is the policy part. The problem is the execution part. Yes, we identify Pakistan as an enemy and China as a serious competitor. But then, what would be our ground level policy when it comes to South Asia, or what would be our policies in order to increase our wherewithal in South Asia or our influence in South Asia? There is a cogent relationship between, it's a linear, fairly linear relationship between our domestic perceptions and our exercises in South Asia. But when it comes to the policy part, somehow we are either confused or we are lacking because we perennially suffer from state incapacity. Our state capacity has perennially been low, has always been low. And for the lack of state capacity, many of our lofty strategic goals have never been realized. So that's about that. I think I'd ended that. I'll be happy to be happy for a conversation on any of these questions if they choose to.
I think, sir, the question is, I will request Apurva to give the last words.
Okay, finally, we have now reached the conclusion of our session today, sir. So I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guest, Mr. Subranil Ghosh, for his engaging and insightful lecture on geopolitics and narratives, especially on South Asian spaces. And it was truly enjoyable, sir. And we appreciate the time and effort you dedicated to this wonderful session and enriching our platform with your knowledge and experience. We look forward to staying connected and hopefully learning more from you, sir, in the future engagement. And thank you so much once again, sir. I would also like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all the viewers for their participation and for their very insightful questions. Last but not the least, I would like to thank Raja and Shulochana for conducting or hosting this session. So before closing the session, I would request our viewers to please subscribe and support our work if you like. And thank you. We'll see you again in the next session. So till then, stay happy and stay healthy. And namaskar, sir. Good
Namaskar.
night.
Thank you
Namaskar.
so much, sir. Thank you so much,
Thank
sir.
you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was truly an enriching experience. Thank you. Hope to be with you
Yes,
sometime
yes,
again.
yes, sir. Okay, okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Good night. Yeah.
Tata. Bye.